The day Myrtle Hale put a bullet hole through the welcome sign at the edge of Dusty Creek, Texas, the whole town learned two things about her. Her aim was perfect, and her patience for fools was non-existent. It was the spring of 1878, and the dust hadn't settled from her wagon wheels before the whispers started rolling through the low-slung buildings of that sun-baked cattle town. A woman alone. A widow, some said. No family to speak of. A homestead claim up on the northern ridge, the kind of land that broke men twice her size. She'd come with a mule named Jasper, a rifle older than most of the men in town, and a silence around her so complete that it seemed to push people back like a physical wall. Myrtle Hale was 28 years old, and she had learned early that softness was a luxury she could not afford. She'd been soft once. Soft and young and foolishly in love with a man named Thomas Hale who had taken her from her family's farm in Missouri at 19 with sweet promises and a silver ring. Thomas had been charming in the way that certain storms are charming before they turn, and by the time Myrtle understood the shape of the life she'd married into, there was no road back. Thomas had died 3 years prior, not heroically, not protecting her, but from a fever he'd caught in a saloon 2 counties over while she'd been home alone planting their winter garden. She had buried him herself. She had cried exactly once, standing at his grave with the sun going down red over the prairie, and then she had walked back to the house and never cried again. She'd sold everything in Missouri that wasn't nailed down, filed her homestead claim on 160 acres of Texas Hill country under the Homestead Act of 1862, and driven herself south with every intention of needing no one and nothing beyond her own 2 hands. Dusty Creek wasn't much to look at. A main street with a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Red Boot that smelled like sawdust and regret, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a land office that doubled as the post station. There was a doctor, a man named Beaufort who looked old enough to have treated injuries from the Mexican-American War, and a sheriff named Garrett who was mostly concerned with keeping the cattle drives from turning his town into a disaster every summer. The land office was Myrtle's first stop. The man behind the counter, there was not the one who would matter to her yet. That man was still 3 weeks and a broken fence away. She confirmed her claim, paid her filing fees from a purse she kept tucked inside her boot, and walked out into the midday glare without acknowledging the stares that followed her down the street. The mercantile was run by a round man named Elias Hooper, whose wife, Della, had the warmest eyes in the county. Della Hooper would become the closest thing Myrtle had to a friend in Dusty Creek, though even that friendship took months to establish because Myrtle did not open doors easily. But Della was patient in her own way, always keeping a small jar of lemon drops near the counter and sliding one across to Myrtle every time she came in, never once pushing for more conversation than Myrtle was willing to give. That first afternoon, Myrtle bought flour, salt, a box of cartridges, coffee, and a length of rope, loaded it all onto Jasper with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing hard things alone for a long time, and made her way up the ridge road to her claim. The house was barely a house. The previous claim holder had put up 4 walls and a roof before abandoning the whole enterprise, and what he'd left behind was a structure that was more optimism than architecture. The door hung crooked. 2 windows had no glass. The floor was packed earth, but the walls were solid, the chimney drew cleanly, and the land around it rolled out in beautiful, brutal hills of Texas scrub oak and limestone, all of it kissed gold in the late afternoon light. Myrtle stood in the doorway of that broken-down house, looked out at the land that was legally hers, and felt something inside her chest that wasn't quite happiness but was at least the shape of possibility. She got to work. Over the following weeks she repaired the door, caulked the walls with clay and grass, cut and set glass for the windows from a pane she purchased from Hooper's store, dug a proper well, and began breaking the hardscrabble soil of the western field for a garden. She worked from first light until the dark made working impossible, and when she lay down on her bedroll each night, she was so tired that not even the deep, echoing loneliness of the place could keep her awake. She did not ask for help. She did not invite neighbors. When the McKendrick family, who farmed the valley below her ridge, sent their oldest boy up with a pie and an offer to assist with her fence line, she thanked the boy politely, gave him a coin for his trouble, and did the fence herself over the course of 4 days in the blazing April heat. She was not cruel about it. She simply did not believe in owing anyone anything. That was still the truth on the morning that Clyde Dalton rode onto her property. She heard the horse before she saw it, a smooth, easy lope that told her the rider knew what he was doing, and she was already holding her rifle in a comfortable, non-threatening grip by the time the man came around the corner of her fence line on a dark bay gelding. He was perhaps 30, she guessed, though the sun and the work of the range had written some of their story across his face, making him look both younger and older depending on the angle. He had brown hair that curled at his collar from the heat and dark eyes that were calm in a way that did not seem performed. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy: canvas trousers, a faded blue shirt, worn leather vest, and his hat was pushed back slightly on his head in a way that made him look like a man not trying to be imposing. He sat his horse the way a person sits in their own kitchen chair, entirely without effort. He stopped about 20 feet from her and did not seem the least bit troubled by the rifle. "Morning," he said. "Are you Myrtle Hale?" "Who's asking?" she said. "Clyde Dalton. I have the spread just east of yours, other side of the creek. I have been meaning to come introduce myself for a few weeks, but the timing hasn't worked out." He paused. "I have some of your cattle." Myrtle stared at him. "I don't have cattle. You have a mule. Jasper doesn't wander." "Well, technically these aren't yours either, but they were on your land before they crossed the creek onto mine. 2 steers, red and white, no brand I recognize. I figured if they were on your property you might have a claim on them, and if you don't, the sheriff is going to want to know about them anyway." He reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a rough hand-drawn map. "Thought you might want to come look before I report them." Myrtle looked at him for a long moment. He didn't fidget under her gaze. He didn't try to fill the silence with conversation. He just waited. "Give me a minute," she said. She set her rifle against the house, went inside, and came back out with her hat, her work gloves, and her rifle again. He noticed the rifle with a very slight smile that was not quite a smile. "You can leave that," he said. "My place is peaceful." "So is mine," she said, and swung up onto Jasper without further comment. They rode east mostly in silence. Myrtle was aware of him in the way she was always aware of potential threats, measuring distance, gauging temperament. But he made no move toward her and asked no questions she didn't want to answer. The morning was already getting warm, the sky that particular deep blue that Texas wore in spring like a kind of arrogance. His spread was neat. That was the first thing she noticed. Not fancy, but cared for. The fence lines were straight and in good repair. The barn was solid. There was a kitchen garden along the south side of the house with things actually growing in it: beans, she thought, and squash, which told her he was either a man who knew what he was doing or had someone at home who did. She glanced around for signs of a woman. There were none. The place had a spare, purposeful quality that she recognized as belonging to a person living alone. The 2 steers were in a small holding pen near the barn, looking unbothered and fat. They were definitely unbranded and definitely not the kind of strays that got lost. They were too well fed for that. Someone had let them loose or lost track of them. "I'll report them to Garrett," Myrtle said. "He can advertise for their owner." "That's what I figured," Clyde said. "But I wanted you to know about them since they were on your land." "Why?" He looked at her with that same calm that she was beginning to find slightly unnerving. "Because they were on your land," he repeated simply, as though that were the entire answer, and perhaps it was. She nodded once. "Thank you. I'll ride into town this afternoon." She expected him to say something else, to push some kind of conversation on her the way men often did when they had something to prove or wanted something from her. But he just touched the brim of his hat and said, "I'll leave you to it then." She rode back to her place with a small, unnamed irritation at the fact that he had been entirely reasonable. She reported the steers to Sheriff Garrett, who noted them down and told her they likely belonged to a trail herd that had passed through 3 weeks prior. He'd send word north. Myrtle rode home, filed Clyde Dalton away in her mind under the heading of neighbor, and went back to her fence. May arrived with heat and wildflowers, and the wildflowers were the only thing she'd allow herself to enjoy without immediately looking for their practical application. She didn't pick them. She just looked at them sometimes in the evenings when the light was going amber and the air smelled of cedar and dry grass, and she let herself feel one small, quiet thing for a few minutes before putting herself to bed. It was on one of those evenings that she heard hammering. She followed the sound down to the creek that divided her land from Clyde Dalton's, and found him on his side of the water fixing a section of fence that the creek had apparently undercut during the spring rains. He was working with the focused attention of a craftsman, fitting each board with care, and he was singing very quietly to himself, something she couldn't quite make out in a low voice that was not unpleasant. He noticed her when she was about 10 feet away and stopped singing but not working. "Evening," he said. "Your fence is on the wrong line," Myrtle said. He stopped working. She pointed. "The survey marker is back there behind that cedar. Your fence has been running about 4 feet inside my property line." He set down his hammer and walked to the cedar she'd indicated, crouched down, and found the iron stake she was pointing at. He measured with his eyes, stood up, and let out a breath that was not quite a sigh. "You're right," he said. "I didn't set this fence. It was here when I bought the place. I'll move it." "I know you didn't set it," she said. "I checked the records. The previous owner was the one who put it wrong." "Still," he said, "it's my fence now. I'll move it." She had been prepared for an argument. She had sharpened her case for it on the walk over. The absence of argument left her with nothing to do but nod and say, "I'd appreciate that." "I'll get it done by end of week," he said. "You want to be here when I move it?" "Yes," she said. "Saturday morning, then." She left without saying goodbye, which was her custom, and walked back up the hill in the long evening light, feeling oddly off balance in a way she didn't have a name for. He moved the fence on Saturday. She watched. He didn't complain or make her feel like an inconvenience. When the job was done and the line was right, he pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and offered it to her, which was a basic courtesy and she knew it, but it still made her hesitate for a fraction of a second before she took it and drank. "Hot work," he said. "Yes," she said, and handed back the canteen. "I make a decent pot of coffee," he said. "If you wanted to, I should get back," she said. He nodded, and there was nothing in his expression that looked like offense or calculation, just acceptance. She walked back up the hill, and she did not look back, and she thought about coffee for approximately 3 hours before she was able to stop. June came, and with it the first real test of her land. A week of dry lightning storms rolled through the hill country, striking twice in her northern pasture and once, horribly, at the corner of her barn roof. She was already running toward the barn with a bucket before the smoke was visible, and she managed to put out the small fire with water from the well and dirt, and sheer panicked effort before it could take hold. She sat on the ground outside the barn afterward, her hands black with soot, her arms trembling, and she looked at the scorch mark on the corner of her roof and felt the full weight of her aloneness press down on her like a flat stone. She sat there for perhaps 5 minutes before she heard hooves. Clyde Dalton came over the ridge at a controlled canter, and behind him was his neighbor from the south, a Mexican-American rancher named Felipe Reyes, who was perhaps 55 and had lived in this valley for 20 years. Both men had clearly seen the smoke. They pulled up when they saw her sitting there in the dirt, alive and unburned. "Fire's out," she said before either of them could speak. "We can see that," Felipe said, with a gentleness that made her want unreasonably to cry. He was off his horse and looking at the roof damage before she had finished standing up. "Not bad, cosmetic. You can patch this with a day's work." "I know," she said. Clyde had dismounted and was walking around the barn perimeter, checking for any smoldering spots she might have missed. He found two. He dealt with them quietly. He asked her permission before he drew water from her well, and she gave it. And she watched him work with a thoroughness that told her he was not performing helpfulness but actually providing it. "You should have a second water barrel at the barn," he said, not accusingly, just factually. "Cuts your time in half if you need it." "I know," she said again, feeling irritated at how much she knew and hadn't yet done. "I have a spare barrel," Felipe said. "Been meaning to do something about it. I will bring it over in the morning." "You don't need to," she started. "I want to," Felipe said simply. "It's a good barrel." She looked between the two of them, this calm, practical man on the horse with the dark eyes, and this older, settled man who spoke of favors as though they were as natural as weather. And she found herself without a good argument. "Thank you," she said, which was a thing she said rarely enough that it felt strange in her mouth. Felipe left first, promising the barrel, and then it was just her and Clyde in the last orange light of the day, and he was standing at his horse's shoulder looking at her with that infuriating patience. "You did well," he said. "A lot of people would have panicked more." "I almost did," she admitted, and was surprised to hear herself say it. He nodded as though that were entirely normal and understandable. "If you want help with the patch repair, I can do it myself." "I know you can," he said. "I've seen what you've done to that place in 2 months. The fence work alone is better than most men could manage. I'm not offering because I think you can't. I'm offering because 2 people can do it in half a day and you do it alone in 2. She looked at him for a long moment. The smoke smell was still in her hair and on her clothes, and her arms still ached, and the logical part of her brain that she always tried to listen to was telling her that he was right about the time. "Sunday," she said. "If you have it free." "I'll have it free," he said. He came on Sunday with a bundle of shingles he'd had left over from his own barn repair, which meant she didn't have to buy them, which was a consideration she had not expected and did not quite know what to do with. They worked side by side on the roof through the morning, and they talked not deeply, not personally, but in the easy language of shared work, figuring out the problem between them, making decisions about material and method. She learned that he had come from Kansas, had worked cattle drives on the Kisham Trail for 3 years before he'd saved enough to buy his own land. He had a brother in Abilene he wrote to occasionally. He had no wife and never had. She offered none of her own history in return, and he did not ask. By noon the roof was done, better than the original. She fed him lunch: salt pork, cornbread, black coffee, and they sat on her porch in the heat and drank the coffee in the same comfortable silence that was becoming, against her best intentions, something she recognized. "You make a good cup," he said. "You said that about yours," she said. "I wasn't lying. Mine is also good." There was a pause. "Maybe sometime I'll find out," she said, and she didn't know why she said it, and she looked out at her fields rather than at him. When he left, she stood on the porch and watched him ride away and told herself that it meant nothing. She was a practical woman. Neighbors helped neighbors out here. That was all this was. She was, as she would later understand, beginning to lie to herself for the first time in years. Summer deepened. The steers had been collected by a ranch outfit from up near Fort Worth that had sent a rider down when Garrett's notice reached them. The rider had thanked her and offered her a small finder's payment, which she accepted because she needed it, and that had been the end of that small adventure. She planted, she tended, she repaired, she managed. She rode into Dusty Creek twice a week for supplies and news, and she developed something close to a rhythm at Della Hooper's counter, where the lemon drops waited, and Della's conversation was warm and never probing. Della, for her part, had noticed something. "Clyde Dalton stopped by yesterday," she mentioned one afternoon in July, sliding a lemon drop across the counter with the casual precision of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. "Did he?" Myrtle said, not looking up from the list she was checking. "He asked if you'd been in recently. Said he wanted to make sure the neighbor situation was going well." Della's voice was smooth as river water. "He seems like a good man." "He's a decent neighbor," Myrtle said. Said Della. Myrtle looked up. Della was arranging tins on a shelf and wearing an expression of pure innocence that Myrtle did not trust for 1 second. Don't, Myrtle said. I haven't done anything, Della said. Della, I'm just saying he's a good man and he has a fine spread and he checks on his neighbors. She lifted one shoulder. That's a nice quality. Myrtle put down her list. My husband was charming too, she said, and the words came out flatter than she intended, with an edge that she hadn't meant to show. Della turned and looked at her fully then, with those warm eyes that saw too much. Not every man is Thomas Hale, she said quietly. The name in someone else's mouth was like cold water. Myrtle picked up her list. No, she said, and I've gotten along fine without any of them. She paid for her goods and left, and the lemon drop sat on the counter where she'd forgotten it. But Della's words followed her up the ridge road like a patient shadow. Not every man is Thomas Hale. She knew that. She wasn't a fool. She knew the arithmetic of it, that one bad man did not make all men bad, that a burned hand didn't mean all fire was evil. She knew it with her brain, cleanly and completely. It was the rest of her that had not gotten the message, the part that had built itself into a fortress so tight and sure that it had forgotten what it was protecting. She was sitting on her porch that evening with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands when she heard her name called from down the hill, and she looked up to see Felipe Reyes's eldest daughter, a capable young woman of 20 named Lucia, riding up with a look of concern on her face. "Miss Hale," Lucia said, pulling her horse up. "My father asked me to come. He heard from old man Garrett that the Perkins brothers have been talking about your claim." Myrtle set down her cup. "What kind of talking?" Lucia's jaw tightened slightly. "The kind that says a woman can't really hold a claim alone, that the land would be better used by," she stopped. "By someone else, is the idea." The Perkins brothers were two men Myrtle had met exactly once, at a town meeting about the water rights for the creek system that fed half the valley. They were big, loud, acquisitive men who owned a medium-sized cattle operation south of Dusty Creek and who seemed to believe that the law was a flexible thing when applied to people they thought less of. She had not liked them then. She liked them considerably less now. "What are they planning?" Myrtle asked. "Papa doesn't know exactly. But they've been to the land office twice this month. He thought you should know." "I appreciate that," Myrtle said. "And please thank your father for me." Lucia left, and Myrtle sat in the darkening evening and thought clearly and strategically, the way she did when a problem needed solving rather than feeling. She went inside and dug out the copy of her homestead filing, her survey documents, and the letter from the land registrar in Austin confirming her claim. Everything was in order. She had been in continuous occupancy. She had improved the land. She had met every legal requirement. But she also knew that legal correctness did not always protect a lone woman when certain kinds of men got it into their heads to push. In the morning she went to the land office and had a long conversation with the registrar, a fussy little man named Wickersham who confirmed that her claim was entirely sound and that no competing claim had been filed. She then went to see Sheriff Garrett, who listened carefully and agreed that the Perkins brothers were the kind of trouble that bore watching. He promised to have a word with them. On her way out of town, she rode past the lumber yard and found Clyde Dalton there, loading planks onto his wagon. He saw her expression before she managed to smooth it. "Something wrong?" he asked. She had not planned to tell him. The words came out anyway. "The Perkins brothers are making noise about my claim." His face went very still in a way that was different from his usual quietness. "What kind of noise?" she told him. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. "Wickersham is right that your claim is solid," he said when she'd finished. "But those two don't always respect solid. I've had my own dealings with them. They tried to run cattle across my south pasture last fall and claimed it was open range." He paused. "Would you be willing to let me come along the next time you go to the land office? 2 witnesses to a confirmation are harder to argue with than one." She looked at him. He was not offering to fight her battles. He was offering to stand beside her while she fought them herself. There was a difference, and she felt it precisely. "Yes," she said. They went back together, and Wickersham recorded Clyde Dalton's name as a secondary witness to the confirmation of her claim, which was a small legal gesture but a meaningful one. On the ride back out of town, Clyde said, "You should know, and I say this as your neighbor not to frighten you, that it would be worth making sure people in the valley know you're there and that you have friends. Not because you need protecting, but because men like the Perkins brothers back down faster when they can't isolate someone." "You're saying I need to be less solitary," Myrtle said. "I'm saying exactly that," he said, without any softening of it. She was quiet for a moment. "That's a harder thing for me than moving a fence line," she said, and it was perhaps the most honest thing she had said to another person in years. He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted slightly, like a light coming on in a far room. "I know," he said simply, "but you can do hard things. I've been watching you do them all summer." She didn't answer. She rode home, but the words sat with her like a coal in a stove, quiet and warm. August was brutal in the way that Texas August always was, heat pressing down on everything without mercy, the creek running lower and the fields needing water that had to be hauled. Myrtle worked in the early morning and the late evening, and rested in the worst of the midday heat, which gave her hours she didn't know what to do with. She read. She had a small collection of books that had traveled with her from Missouri, a Bible, a volume of poems by Walt Whitman that Thomas had bought for her in a rare moment of generosity, and a practical agricultural handbook that she consulted like scripture. She wrote letters to her sister Eleanor in St. Louis, letters that were carefully cheerful and carefully incomplete. She and Eleanor had not been close for years, not since Myrtle had married Thomas against Eleanor's advice, and there was an old injury between them that had never fully healed. In one of those August afternoons, she was sitting in the shade of her porch reading Whitman when she heard hooves and looked up to see Clyde coming up the road. He was not riding fast, not with the purposeful air of someone bringing news. He had something in his saddlebag that clinked. He pulled up and said, "Peaches." She looked at him. "I was in town and Hooper got a crate of canned peaches from a supply train. I bought an extra couple of tins because they're not something you see out here often. I thought you might want one." He produced the tin from his saddlebag. "Consider it a neighborly gesture." She looked at the tin and then at him. It was such a simple thing, a tin of peaches on a hot afternoon, and she did not know why it made her throat feel unexpectedly tight. "I'm not going to refuse canned peaches," she said. He smiled at that, a real smile, the first full one she'd seen from him, and it rearranged his face in a way that she noted and then carefully put aside. "You want to open them now?" he asked. She should have said no. She said, "I suppose you deserve a cup of coffee for your trouble." He dismounted, tied his horse to her fence post, and came and sat on her porch while she fetched a cup and a kitchen knife and a bowl. They opened the peaches and ate them in the shade, and the sweetness of them was extraordinary against the heat and the dust, and she closed her eyes for a moment on the first bite without thinking, which was a small, unguarded thing she hadn't meant to let him see. When she opened her eyes, he was looking out at her fields, not at her, which told her he had the decency to pretend he hadn't noticed. "They're planting again north of Fort Worth," he said, conversationally. "The trail drives are going to change. I've been thinking about what that means for small operators out here." She found herself in a real conversation about the cattle trade and the encroachment of the railways and the changing economics of the Texas range, and it was the kind of conversation she had not had with anyone since Missouri, since she'd been a person who read newspapers and had opinions and argued them. She had not known how hungry she was for it until it started. They talked for nearly 2 hours. When he left, he touched his hat brim and said, "Same time next week," with a slight, careful smile. She should have said she didn't know. She said, "I'll make sure the coffee is ready." And that was how it began, not with a declaration. Not with any of the architecture of courtship she had been taught to expect. It began with peaches and coffee on a hot August afternoon, and it continued like that simply, incrementally, honestly, in the weeks that followed. He came on Tuesday and Friday afternoons through the rest of August, and sometimes she rode over to his place instead, and they talked about everything and nothing. The cattle markets and the politics of Reconstruction, and the nature of the soil in the hill country, and the constellations that came out over Texas at night with a clarity she had not expected. He told her about the Kishom Trail, about driving 3,000 head of longhorns north with 11 men, about the storms and the river crossings and the loneliness of the plains. She listened with her whole attention, which was the most she had given anyone in years. She still didn't tell him much about herself. He still didn't ask. But something was loosening in her, slowly and against her will, like ice at the edge of a river when the air first warms. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a change in the weather before it arrives, a shift in pressure, a new quality to the light, and she distrusted it deeply even as she could not seem to stop it. In early September, the Perkins brothers made their move. It was not violent. They were not quite brazen enough for that, with Garrett in the picture, but it was ugly. They sent a lawyer from San Antonio, a slick man named Hartwell, to file a formal contest of her claim on the grounds that she had allegedly not maintained continuous occupancy, citing a supposed 2-week absence in June. There had been no such absence. Myrtle had not left her land for more than a single day since she'd arrived. She sat in Wickersham's office and felt cold rage move through her in a clean, controlled current. "This is fabricated," she said. Wickersham looked uncomfortable. "The contest requires an inquiry regardless. That's the process." "Then process it," she said, "and I will provide every piece of evidence necessary." She left his office and stood on the main street of Dusty Creek in the September heat and thought about what she needed. She needed witnesses to her occupancy. She needed people who could swear they had seen her on her land during the period in question. Felipe Reyes had come to her place twice during June, once with the water barrel and once to check on her after a bad lightning week. Lucia had been there. Della Hooper had noted her visits to the store in her account book, which was a dated record. And Clyde Dalton had been at her place for the roof repair on a Sunday in mid-June, which was squarely inside the contested period. She found Clyde at the feed store 20 minutes later. She told him what had happened. His expression went through something she had not seen on him before, not exactly anger, but a kind of settled, hard clarity that reminded her that the patience he wore so easily was not weakness. "I'll testify," he said immediately. "You might be called to court if it comes to that." "Good, I was there. I fixed the roof with you. I know the date." He paused. "Those brothers are going to learn that they picked the wrong neighbor to harass." She assembled her witnesses. She sent a formal written statement to the land office in Austin with dates, witness names, and a detailed account of every improvement she had made to the property during the period in question. Wickersham received it with a slightly awed expression. Garrett had a pointed conversation with the Perkins brothers and their lawyer that left the lawyer looking considerably less slick. 6 weeks later, the contest was dismissed. Myrtle's claim was reconfirmed in full. The brothers did not come near her property again. The night she got word of the dismissal, she sat on her porch alone and let herself feel something she had not felt in a long time, the specific, quiet satisfaction of having fought for something and won. Not just survived, won. She had built something here on this hard land, and she had defended it with the only weapons that mattered: documentation, testimony, and the truth. She thought about the people who had stood up with her. Felipe and his family, Della with her account book, Garrett with his quiet authority, and Clyde, who had said good at the prospect of going to court as though it were an opportunity rather than an inconvenience. She thought about that for a long time. October arrived in Texas with a mercy that no other month had, the heat finally breaking, the air going cool and blue in the mornings, the hills turning gold and russet with the scrub oak. It was the most beautiful thing Myrtle had seen in years, and she let herself say so out loud on one of their Tuesday afternoons, sitting on Clyde's porch with coffee and watching the light fall across the valley. "It is," he agreed. "Best time of year out here." "I understand why people stay," she said. He looked at her. "Were you thinking about not staying?" She considered the question honestly. "When I first came, I told myself I would see 1 year." Couldn't make a go of it in 1 year. I didn't know. Go somewhere else. Start again. She paused. I seem to have made a go of it. You have, he said, considerably more than a go. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. Thank you for the roof, for the land office, for she stopped because the list was longer than she had expected when she started, and it surprised her. You don't owe me thanks, he said. I know I don't, she said. That's why I'm giving it. There was a pause. The kind of pause that is weight. Myrtle, he said quietly, and the use of her first name in his voice was different from how anyone else said it. I want to ask you something. She felt the armor she had built and maintained and polished for years pull itself tight around her, but she sat still and said, Go ahead. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, and I want you to know that whatever you answer, I am not going to disappear on you or turn into a different person. He looked at her steadily. I would very much like to know if you might consider, in whatever time feels right to you, whether there might be something here between us worth naming. She looked at the hills. She looked at the coffee cup in her hands. She thought about Thomas Hale and about the girl she had been at 19 and about the woman sitting on this porch now who could fix a roof and fight a legal contest and survive a lightning strike and who still in her deepest places was afraid. I don't know, she said, and it was the most honest answer she had ever given. He nodded. That's enough, he said. That's not a no. It's not, she agreed. Then I'm not in any hurry, he said, and picked up his coffee cup again. She looked at him. Why not? She asked, and the question had more in it than it seemed. He thought about it. Because what you are is worth being patient for, he said simply. She looked away again quickly, because her face was doing something she didn't want him to see yet. But she felt his words settle into her like water into dry ground, slow and deep and irreversible. November brought a cattle drive through the valley that raised dust and noise for 4 days and left the creek bank trampled. It also brought an unexpected visitor to Myrtle's door, her sister Eleanor. Eleanor arrived in a hired buggy from the stage stop in Dusty Creek, looking exhausted and overdressed for the terrain, and carrying a small trunk that told Myrtle this was not a brief visit. Myrtle stood in the doorway of her house and felt the complicated storm of a complicated history move through her all at once. Eleanor, she said. Eleanor looked at her, at the house, at the land, at the rifle leaning against the door frame, at Myrtle's sun-darkened skin and work-calloused hands and the absolute lack of apology in her posture, and her face did something complicated too. You look well, Eleanor said, which was clearly not what she'd expected to say. You look, Myrtle, you look genuinely well. Come inside, Myrtle said. I'll put on coffee. Eleanor stayed for 2 weeks, and it was the most sustained human company Myrtle had kept since coming to Texas, and it was both harder and better than she'd expected. They had the old argument on the second day, the one that had lived between them since Missouri, Eleanor saying that Thomas had been a mistake she'd tried to warn Myrtle about. Myrtle saying she'd been old enough to make her own mistakes, Eleanor saying that wasn't the point, Myrtle saying it was exactly the point. But they were older now, and the anger had weathered down to something more like grief, and by the 3rd day they were past it and into something rawer and more real. Are you happy here? Eleanor asked one evening, sitting at Myrtle's table with a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the dark Texas hills. I don't think about happy, Myrtle said automatically. Eleanor looked at her with an expression that was half exasperation and half sorrow. Myrtle, you're allowed to think about happy. Myrtle considered this. I think about whether I have enough to eat and whether my fences are sound and whether I've done enough work to justify tomorrow, she said. Happy seems extra. It's not extra, Eleanor said firmly. It is the point. All the fences in the world are not the point. She paused. I'm saying this because I love you and not to be right. Myrtle was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I know you are. Clyde came on his usual Tuesday afternoon while Eleanor was still there, and Myrtle introduced them with the brisk efficiency of someone trying to make something seem less significant than it was. Eleanor shook his hand, said nice to meet you, and then looked at him with the comprehensive assessment that sisters are capable of when they have known each other their whole lives. After Clyde left, after they had sat on the porch, all three of them, and talked about the valley and the weather and the cattle trade with a naturalness that Myrtle noticed but tried not to analyze, Alina turned to her sister with an expression that required no words. "Don't," Myrtle said. "That man is in love with you," Alina said. "You've known him for 40 minutes. "I've known you for 28 years, Alina said, "and I have never seen you look at anyone the way you just looked at him." "Which you only did when you thought no one was watching." She reached over and put her hand over Myrtle's. "Myrtle, you're not 19 anymore. You know the difference between a man who will hurt you and one who won't." Myrtle looked at her hand under Alina's hand. "I know the difference," she said slowly. "I'm just not sure what to do with the difference." "You let him in," Alina said simply. It sounded easy. It was not easy. Nothing about it was easy. But Alina left at the end of 2 weeks with a promise to write more, a real promise this time, and the air between the sisters was cleaner than it had been in nearly a decade. Myrtle stood at the end of her road and watched the hired buggy take her sister down to the stage stop, and felt the ache of it and didn't push the ache away. Then she went inside, sat down at her table and wrote Clyde Dalton a note. She had never written him a note before. They communicated by riding to each other's fences or by hollering across the creek when needed, in the way of neighbors who live close enough to the land that formality feels unnecessary. But this felt like it needed to be written. She wrote, "I have been thinking about what you said in October. I don't have a different answer yet, but I wanted you to know that I am thinking about it, and that your patience is not wasted on me." She sent it with a boy from the McKendrick farm who carried messages for a nickel, and she spent the rest of the afternoon trying not to think about it. His answer came the next morning, also by the McKendrick boy. He had written, "That is all I needed to hear. Take all the time you need. I will be here." She read it twice. She folded it and put it in the front cover of her Whitman poems, which was the most sentimental thing she had done in years. And she told herself firmly that it was for practical record-keeping purposes, and she didn't quite believe herself. December brought cold that was less brutal than Missouri but still had teeth, and Myrtle discovered that her house was less well insulated than she'd thought when the north wind came hunting. She remedied this with caulking and a set of heavy curtains. She sewed herself from a bolt of wool she bought from Hooper's store, and the house became warm enough, snug and firelit in the evenings while the wind moved through the cedar trees outside. She baked more in winter, bread and corn cakes and simple pies from dried fruit, and the house smelled of it, and she found that she liked it, the domesticity of it that she had never been able to enjoy in Missouri because Thomas had always been a presence that made domestic peace conditional. She had Clyde over for dinner for the first time in December, 2 weeks before Christmas. She made stew with venison from a deer that Felipe Reyes had provided in one of his periodic acts of generosity, and biscuits, and the pecan pie she'd figured out from a recipe Della had written out for her. He ate with the clean appreciation of a man who cooked adequately for himself and was grateful to eat something someone had made with care. He said the biscuits were the best he'd had since Kansas, which she suspected was true rather than flattery, because he was not a man who used flattery. After dinner, they sat by her fire, and he told her something he had not told her before, about why he had left Kansas, which had to do with a bad year for cattle and a family obligation, and a decision to start over at the age of 26 with very little left to his name. The way he told it was not self-pitying. He was simply accounting for himself, putting pieces of his history in front of her the way he might put maps on a table. She understood what he was doing, and she felt the armor inside her shift slightly, like a thing that has been standing rigid for so long that it has forgotten it could move. Thomas was not a good man, she said, and it came out before she had decided to say it. He didn't move. He just listened. He was not violent, exactly. He was absent, careless. There are different ways of being unkind. She looked at the fire. I learned to not need things from him because he couldn't give them. And then I learned to not need things from anyone, which I thought was the smarter lesson, but I'm not sure anymore. I'm sorry, he said, that he was like that. I'm not looking for sorry, she said. She paused. I'm explaining something about why I am the way I am. You don't owe me an explanation, he said. I know. She looked at him then directly and held his gaze. I'm offering one anyway. He held her gaze. The fire moved. The wind moved in the cedars outside. Something in the room was different now, and they both knew it, and neither of them looked away. Myrtle, he said, and his voice was careful and certain at the same time. Would you be willing to let me court you? Formally, or informally, however you prefer it. I'm not asking you to promise me anything. I'm asking if you would allow it. She thought about Alina's saying that she knew the difference between a man who would hurt her and one who wouldn't. She thought about all the small true things he had shown her. The moved fence and the moved barrel and the roof and the land office and the peaches on a hot afternoon and the months of patience and the 2 letters in her Whitman book. She thought about the girl who had been soft once and the woman who had made herself hard and the question of what lived underneath the hardness which she had genuinely forgotten. Yes, she said, I would allow it. He didn't move toward her. He didn't change the physical distance between them at all, which told her that he understood completely. He just said, thank you, and there was so much in it, quiet and solid and warm, that it felt like the beginning of something real. Christmas came to Dusty Creek with a quiet that Myrtle found she liked. The town doing its small celebrations, the church filling up on Christmas Eve with everyone who could get there, and the sound of carols coming across the cold air as she rode past on her way home from Hooper's store. She paused outside and listened for a moment, and something in the music moved through her chest and found a tender place she hadn't known was still there. She and Clyde exchanged gifts. She gave him a pair of work gloves she had cut and sewn herself from good leather she'd saved for the purpose, and he gave her a book. It was a volume on practical horticulture for the Texas region, which was entirely practical and also, somehow, one of the most personal gifts she had ever received, because it told her he had been paying attention to what she was building. She held the book and read the inscription he had written on the front page, "For Myrtle who grows things in difficult ground." It was not poetry, but it was true, and she thought truth was better than poetry. She looked up at him. I think, she said slowly, that I might be in some danger of caring for you a great deal. He smiled, and it was the full version, the one that rearranged his face completely. I'm in no danger, he said. I'm already there. She reached out and put her hand on his arm just briefly, just the lightest press of her fingers on his sleeve, and then pulled it back. But it was the first time she had reached for him, and they both felt it land like a footstep on new ground. January of 1879 was cold and close, and the valley settled into the slow work of winter, maintaining fences and animals and woodpiles, watching the sky for weather, making the long planning lists that people on the land make in winter for everything they'll do when the ground opens again. Myrtle and Clyde fell into a rhythm that was different from the summer one, more domestic, more certain of itself. He had dinner at her place twice a week, and she had supper at his once or twice, and they were in each other's company enough that the people in Dusty Creek began to nod knowingly at the pairing in a way that Myrtle noticed but found, to her own surprise, that she didn't mind. What she minded less than she expected were a lot of things. His opinions, which she often disagreed with and argued about freely. His humor, which was dry and came out at unexpected moments. His tendency to think out loud when solving a problem, so that she sometimes sat and listened to him work through a decision about his cattle or his fencing, as though she were the audience for his own mind. She found that she liked being that audience. It made her feel included in something. She was also, she had to admit to herself in the dark of a January night, extraordinarily happy when he was near. Not the conditional happiness she had once hoped for from Thomas, but a steady, quiet kind that sat in her chest like a lamp well trimmed and burning. She still had the armor. She still had the instinct to pull back, to deflect, to stand up a little straighter when things got too close to her center. But she was learning slowly, and with Clyde's consistent patience as her model, that those instincts didn't always need to be obeyed. One afternoon in late January he came to check on her during a hard wind that had been rattling the valley since morning, and she opened the door to him and said, without planning to, I'm glad you're here." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that was so openly fond that she felt it like a hand on her chest. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I'm better than all right. I don't say things like that very often, and I wanted to practice." He laughed at that, a genuine laugh, and she thought she might be in love with the sound of it. And then she thought she might be in love with him. And then she thought that she had been for a while and had simply been refusing to use the word. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." He came inside, and she made coffee, and they sat by her fire while the wind worked itself out around the house, and he reached across the table and took her hand in his. It was unhurried and clear and warm. She looked at their joined hands on her table. His hand was large and work-roughened and completely steady. She thought about how many times she had decided not to need another hand in hers, and how that decision had served a purpose and now felt like something she could set down. She let her fingers lace through his. Neither of them said anything for a long time, and the silence between them was the sweetest kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled because it is already full. It was February when he asked her to marry him. He did not make a production of it. They were sitting on the fence of his holding pen watching his cattle in the late afternoon sun, drinking coffee from tin cups because they had developed the habit of having coffee in whichever place the afternoon happened to find them, and he said, "I want to spend my life with you, if you'll have me." She looked at his profile in the winter light. The straight nose, the quiet set of his jaw, the eyes that were always calm unless they were laughing. She thought about the word yes and what it had meant the last time she'd said it to a man, and she deliberately set that memory aside because it did not belong here, in this clean winter air, with this man who had spent months showing her who he was without ever once trying to be something else. "I will have you," she said. He turned and looked at her with something so full and open on his face that it made her own eyes sting, and she let them sting, because she was done pretending that she didn't feel things. She had been wearing armor so long that she'd forgotten there was anything underneath worth protecting, and he had been patient enough, stubborn enough in his own quiet way, to find out. He leaned in and kissed her, slowly, and with the same quality of patience and certainty that he had brought to everything between them. And she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable, because Myrtle Hale had a great deal of heart underneath everything she'd buried it with. They were married in April of 1879, exactly 1 year after she had arrived in Dusty Creek with a mule and a rifle, and no intention of needing anyone. The ceremony was held at the church with the crooked steeple, performed by the Reverend Marsh, who had lived in the valley 20 years and had buried some of these same people's parents. The small church was full. Felipe and his wife and all 6 of his children, Della and Elias Hooper, Garrett and his deputy, the McKendrick family who came in a wagon carrying enough food for twice the gathering, old Dr. Beaufort, who seemed pleased to attend something celebratory for once, and a leaner, who had come all the way from St. Louis for it, and who cried through the whole ceremony with an expression of deep and complicated happiness. Myrtle wore her best dress, which was a deep blue cotton that Della had helped her alter and press, and she carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Lucia Reyes had gathered that morning from the hillside. She walked herself to the altar, which felt right. She had always walked herself to the places that mattered. Clyde was waiting for her at the front of the church in a clean white shirt and his best vest, and a look on his face that made her step falter slightly with the force of it, not uncertainty, but the overwhelming reality of being looked at like that by someone who meant it completely. She didn't falter. She kept walking. She always did. The Reverend said the words, and they said their words back, and when it was done and Clyde kissed his bride and the small church made its noise of happiness, Myrtle put her face against his shoulder for just a moment and felt the armor that had been her constant companion since she was 19 years old go quiet. Not gone. She didn't think it would ever be entirely gone, but quiet and laid down willingly in a place where it was no longer needed. The celebration afterward went on through the afternoon and into the evening on the grounds of the church, with Felipe producing a guitar and someone's fiddle coming out, and food spread across 3 trestle tables, and Dusty Creek showing itself capable of joy in the way that small, hard-working places can when they decide to be joyful. Even the Perkins brothers had the grace to stay home, which was the greatest contribution they could have made. Myrtle danced with her husband in the last of the evening light, which was something she had not expected to do in Texas, and which she did badly and cheerfully. Clyde was only a marginally better dancer, and they kept pace with each other through a laughing, imprecise waltz while Felipe played and Elena watched from a chair with her handkerchief pressed to her mouth and her eyes bright. They rode home together under a sky thick with April stars, Clyde on his dark bay and Myrtle on Jasper, who was not a romantic animal but who walked along contentedly enough in the cool air. The land stretched out on all sides of them, their land now, the two claimed side by side in the dark, and Myrtle looked up at the stars and breathed in the cedar-scented air and thought, "This is mine. This is real. I made this." They moved into Clyde's house, which was somewhat larger, and Myrtle spent a productive week reorganizing it to her satisfaction, which Clyde tolerated with the good humor of a man who had expected nothing less. She hung her curtains in the bedroom and installed her bookshelf in the sitting room and transplanted her kitchen garden to the south wall of the new house where the light was better. Then she turned her attention to her original claim. Her 160 acres were not going to sit idle. They expanded the operation, adding a proper kitchen garden and an orchard of young fruit trees on the eastern slope of the ridge, planting a pasture of winter rye that they could cut for hay. The two spreads together made something real, a working ranch with enough cattle to be profitable, enough garden to be self-sufficient, and enough land to build something that might last. Felipe helped them plan the hay cutting. Della Hooper organized a summer gathering that functioned as a working bee, getting fences repaired, and a new outbuilding framed in a single day with the willing hands of the valley's farms and ranches, because that was what communities did out here when they did things right. Summer came again, the second summer, and this one was different in ways that mattered. On a warm July morning, Myrtle sat in the kitchen of their house, drinking coffee before the heat settled in, and looking out the window at the hills she had been looking at for over a year now, the hills she knew the way you know a face you love, and she felt the quiet of it settle into her bones. Not the empty quiet she had once manufactured to protect herself, but the full quiet of a life that had come to rest in the right place. She was carrying their child. She had suspected it for 3 weeks and confirmed it with old Dr. Beaufort 6 days ago, who had delivered the news with the matter-of-fact warmth of a man who had seen enough of life to know what truly mattered in it. She had not yet told Clyde. She was going to tell him today. She waited until the evening, until they had eaten and were sitting on the porch with the last of the light going gold over the hills, and then she said, "I went to see Dr. Beaufort last week." He set down his coffee cup immediately. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine," she said. "Better than fine, I am told." She paused. "We're going to have a child." The way his face changed was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Not one single emotion, but a whole sequence of them. Surprise and wonder and something so tender that it almost broke her. And then finally a joy so complete that it quieted everything else. He reached over and took her hand in both of his. "Myrtle," he said, and her name in his voice like that was its own sentence. "Dr. Beaufort says February," she said. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she felt it all the way to her bones. "February," he repeated, and looked out at the hills that were theirs, and she could see him already imagining it. A child on this land, in this house, under this sky, and she felt that same imagination run through her like water, like warmth, like the green first push of something planted in good ground. She wrote to Elena that night. The letter was longer than her usual ones, and warmer, and in it she said things she had not been able to say before because she had not believed them yet. That she was happy, genuinely and fully happy, and that the land she had been afraid was going to break her had instead given her something she hadn't known to look for. Aliner's reply came 3 weeks later, covering 4 full pages in her sister's precise hand, full of joy and advice and plans to come for the birth, and ending with, "I told you he was a good man. Myrtle, I am so glad you let him in." The pregnancy was not easy. Nothing on a working ranch in the Texas Hill Country was easy, but Myrtle was constitutionally unable to be fragile about it. She modified her work, consulted Dr. Beaufort regularly, and accepted help from Clyde and from the neighbors who offered it with, if not grace, at least the absence of argument. Clyde took on more of the heavy work without being asked, and without making her feel diminished by the accommodation, which was the exact right way to do it. There were conversations in those months that they had not had before, the kind that come with the deepening of 2 lives into one. She told him more about Missouri, about her childhood, her father who had been a quiet and decent man and who had died when she was 15, her mother who had been strong and brittle, and from whom Myrtle had perhaps inherited more than she intended, about the girl she had been before Thomas, who had liked books and argued fiercely about politics and wanted to understand how things worked. "That person is still here," Clyde said, when she described her, with a matter-of-factness that made her laugh. "She got buried," Myrtle said. "Buried things come back up," he said. "If the ground is right." She looked at him. "When did you get philosophical?" "I've always been philosophical." "You were too busy being formidable to notice." She laughed, a real laugh, and he looked at her with such open delight at the sound of it that she felt it again, that specific, unguarded happiness that she was still learning to hold. The fall came, and with it the harvesting and the preserving and the putting up that was the music of the season. They worked together with an efficiency that had grown up between them naturally over their months of shared labor, knowing without asking who would do what, filling in each other's gaps, completing each other's tasks. She thought sometimes that this was perhaps what a real marriage was supposed to look like. Not the grand gestures, but the steady orchestration of 2 capable people choosing each other continuously in small ways. Felipe's family came for the harvest gathering, bringing their own corn and squash and the mild cerveza that Felipe made in his cellar, and it turned into a 3-day affair that left the root cellar and the larder fully stocked against the winter, and everyone in the valley feeling the richness of what they'd built together here. Myrtle stood in her kitchen on the last evening of October, listening to the sounds of the valley settling into autumn dark, and thought about how she had arrived here alone and hard and sealed against the world, and how the world had come in anyway through cracks she hadn't known were there, through small kindnesses she hadn't been able to refuse, through one patient man who had not pushed and had not retreated and had simply been there. She put her hand over her rounded belly and felt the small movement that happened now several times a day, and she let herself feel all of it without any part of her reaching for the armor. The baby came in February of 1880, as Dr. Beaufort had predicted, in the deep cold of a clear winter night with Aliner, who had come down from St. Louis 3 weeks early, which was the best decision Aliner had ever made, and Della Hooper, and an efficient midwife named Mrs. Taggart at Myrtle's side. It was a boy. He arrived in the world at about 2 in the morning, red-faced and considerable and expressing strong opinions immediately, and Myrtle held him against her chest and looked at his face and felt something open in her that had never been open before, something completely without armor, without qualification, without the possibility of defensive retreat. Clyde was allowed in 15 minutes later, and the look on his face when he saw the 2 of them together was the second thing she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression of entirely unguarded wonder, and then he looked at his wife with something deeper and more complicated, and she knew exactly what it was because she was feeling it too. "Hello," Clyde said softly to the baby, as though greeting a person he had been waiting to meet for a long time. "He's loud," Myrtle said, which made Aliner laugh from the doorway. "He takes after his mother," Clyde said, and she threw a pillow at him, which was the most domestic and unarmored thing she had done in years, and it felt wonderful. They named him James for Clyde's father and gave him Hale as a middle name, because Myrtle's name was her own and she was not yet done with it. James Hale Dalton, who came into the world on a February night in 1880 on a ranch in the Texas Hill Country that his parents had built between them from hard ground and patience and honest love. Spring came. The valley greened up. The fruit trees on the eastern slope put out their first tentative blossoms, white and pink and sweet-smelling in the warm air, and Myrtle walked among them with James in a cloth sling against her chest, and let herself feel, completely and without apology, the extravagant goodness of her life. She had worn her stubbornness like armor for so long that she had truly forgotten what was underneath it. The woman who had wanted things, who had hoped for things, who had felt things deeply and richly and without restraint. The woman who had been buried by a bad marriage and a harder widowhood and the long discipline of necessary solitude. That woman had not died. She had been waiting, underneath all that careful hardness, for the ground to be safe enough to come back up. Clyde had made the ground safe. Not by being perfect, he was not perfect. He could be stubborn in his own way, and he had strong opinions about cattle management that she disagreed with frequently, and there were mornings when he was slow to wake and evenings when he was too tired to talk, but by being consistently, reliably himself, by showing up, by waiting, by treating her capability as a thing to be respected rather than overcome, and her heart as a thing to be earned rather than demanded. In the summer of 1880, they had a small sign made for the road gate by a man in town who did such things. It read, "Dalton Ranch," but below it, in smaller letters that had been Myrtle's idea and that Clyde had agreed to immediately and completely, it read, "Hale Dalton, established 1878," because she had been here first, and that mattered, and he understood that it mattered. Felipe Reyes saw it on his way past one morning and pulled up his horse and looked at it for a moment, and then looked up at the house, where Myrtle was visible on the porch with the baby, and he smiled the smile of a man who has watched something good come true in his own valley. He tipped his hat to her, and she tipped hers back. Fall of 1880 found them well provisioned, the cattle in good condition, the orchard's first small harvest of peaches and plums put up in jars that lined the cellar shelf like a row of small suns. James had grown into a determined baby of 8 months who had strong feelings about crawling and even stronger feelings about being put down, and who was adored with a specificity that made visiting neighbors smile. Garrett came by in October to say that the Perkins brothers had finally done enough wrong in enough places that a judge from Austin had taken an interest in their land practices, and it seemed likely that their operation would be significantly curtailed going forward. He told this to both Myrtle and Clyde and clearly took satisfaction in delivering it. "Thank you, Garrett," Myrtle said. "Thank yourself," he said. "You're the one who documented everything and held the line. A lot of folks in your position just gave up." He paused at the gate on his way out and looked back at her. "That sign is good," he said. "Hale Dalton, that's right." She watched him ride down the road and thought about what it meant to have your name on something, to have built something with your name on it in a country that had not always made that easy for a woman alone. She was not alone anymore, but her name was still on it, and that was its own kind of rightness. Christmas of 1880 was the loudest the house had ever been, with a leaner there again from St. Louis. She had made the trip twice now, and Myrtle suspected she might make it annually, which was a future she found she looked forward to, and Felipe's whole family coming for Christmas dinner, and James deciding that the occasion required him to pull himself upright using the leg of the table and take 3 wobbling, magnificent steps before sitting down hard on the kitchen floor. Clyde caught him on the 4th step, which was the one that would have ended badly, and held him up triumphantly while the room cheered, and James looked at all the cheering faces with the specific satisfaction of someone who has been exactly this person all along, and simply needed everyone else to notice. Myrtle looked at her son and her husband and her sister and the gathered people who had become her world here in this valley, and she thought, I could not have imagined this. A year ago I could not have imagined this. 5 years ago I was keeping myself alive and calling that living. This was living. In February of 1881, James Hale Dalton turned 1 year old, and the valley celebrated it in the way that valleys with good hearts celebrate these things. Simply, and together, with food and noise and a great deal of contentment. Myrtle sat on her porch that evening after everyone had gone and the house was quiet, the baby asleep and Clyde inside settling the fire, and she looked out at the February dark over her land, their land. And she thought about the woman who had driven a wagon up this road almost 3 years ago with a mule named Jasper and a rifle, and the absolute intention of being entirely sufficient unto herself. That woman had been brave. She had survived things that deserved respect. And she had been right about some things, right that she was capable, right that she could build something from nothing, right that she did not need to be rescued. But she had been wrong about not needing anyone. She could see that clearly now from here, from this porch that she had built and repaired and sat on for 3 springs. You could be completely capable and still be richer for having someone to sit beside. You could be entirely sufficient and still be made more by love. The armor had served her when she needed it. Laying it down had not made her less. It had made her more. The door opened behind her, and Clyde came out with 2 cups of coffee, which was a ceremony they had performed so many hundreds of times by now that it had become something sacred in its ordinariness. He handed her a cup and sat down beside her and looked out at the same dark hills she was looking at. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Nothing," she paused. "3 years ago I told myself I didn't need anyone." "I know," he said. "I could tell that on the first morning I rode up. You didn't say anything about it." "I didn't think it was my place to," he said. Yet, she looked at him in the dark. "When did you know?" she asked. "That you early," he said simply. "Before the peaches." She laughed softly. The peaches were a calculated move. "They were," he agreed without any shame. "Did they work?" She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she still did with the faint quality of amazement at the fact that it was allowed, that she was allowed to do this, that this was her life. "They worked," she said. He put his arm around her, and they sat together in the quiet of a Texas February night, their ranch spreading out around them in the dark, their son sleeping inside, their future arranged around them like a field in early spring, all of it possible, none of it guaranteed, all of it worth the work. The years that followed were good years, not perfect years, because no years are perfect but good in the solid, enduring way that the land itself was good, demanding and rewarding in proportion to what you gave it, honest in its returns. In the spring of 1882, they had a second child, a daughter they named Clara Aliner, for Aliner, and for no other reason except that Aliner wept on the telephone. No, there were no telephones. Aliner wept when Myrtle's letter reached St. Louis, and replied that the name was the finest gift she had ever been given. Clara came into the world with her mother's dark eyes and her father's even temperament, which was a combination that her older brother James found immediately useful because Clara was never as loud about her opinions as he was. James, by 3 years old, had his mother's stubbornness and his father's patience, and a fearlessness about the outdoors that kept both his parents alternately impressed and terrified. He followed Clyde around the ranch like a small, purposeful shadow, learning the names of things and the ways of things, and he followed Myrtle around the kitchen garden with the same attention, pulling weeds with a seriousness that made her laugh. She was 40 years old in 1892, and standing on her porch on her 40th birthday, looking out at what 12 years in the Texas Hill Country had made of her life. The original homestead house was still standing. They used it for storage now, and sometimes when Myrtle needed to think she went and stood in the doorway of it and looked at the land the way she had looked at it on the first evening, all gold and possible. The orchard was a real orchard now, grown full, reliable in its seasons, giving every year what the years had put into it. James was 12 and already tall, helping his father with the cattle work and reading his mother's books in the evenings with an attention that told her she had somehow managed to pass on the part of herself she'd been most afraid was dead. Clara was 10 and determined and fierce in a way that made Myrtle look in the mirror and grin. Clyde was 42 and still the same man she had first seen riding up her fence line on a dark bay horse, patient and capable and clear-eyed and honest, with a humor that had grown richer over the years and a love for his wife and children that he wore without embarrassment, which was perhaps the thing she was most grateful for. That evening on her birthday they sat on their porch with their coffee, always the coffee, always this ceremony between them, and the children were inside and the hills were going the color of embers, and Clyde said, "Happy birthday, Myrtle." She turned to look at him. "You know," she said, "the night I arrived in Dusty Creek I shot a hole in the welcome sign." He nodded. He'd heard this story. "I did it because I wanted everyone to know I wasn't someone to push around," she said. "And I stand by it as a strategy." "Effective," he agreed, "but I also think," she paused, weighing the words, "I think I was so busy making sure no one could get close enough to hurt me that I almost missed all of this." She gestured at the hills and the ranch and the lamplight coming from the windows and the sounds of their children inside. "I almost missed everything." He reached over and took her hand in his, the way he had on that January afternoon at her kitchen table in the first winter, and she held on. "You didn't miss it," he said. "You were patient enough," she said. "You were worth it," he said. "You are worth it. There is not a version of the story where I gave up and found something else to do with my time." He smiled. "You were the most interesting thing that had ever ridden into this valley. I was not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long time. This man, this life, this land. "I love you, Clyde Dalton," she said, and it still had the quality it had always had, a gift offered rather than a debt paid, a chosen thing rather than a necessary one. "I love you, Myrtle Hale," he said, and he always called her that, always the name she had brought with her, because it was hers and he respected that it was hers. The Texas stars came out overhead, as thick and clear as they had always been, and the valley settled into its evening sounds, and the lamp burned warm in the window, and Myrtle sat on her porch with her husband's hand in hers and let herself be completely, unreservedly, entirely happy. Not because happiness was a luxury she had allowed herself at last, because she had built a life where it was simply what was true.